maybe I will say just 2 words before we hit play. This was a short, I was asked basically to produce something to aid legal professionals, actually all kinds of professionals who come into contact with Indigenous women who are survivors of violence. Just from the experience that often in seeking services, women are re-traumatized by the attitudes and the responses that they receive in the system. So our goal was basically to create video for people who don't really want to watch the video. So I was trying to get it to be under 5 minutes, didn't quite make the 5-minute mark, but it's at about 6 minutes. And it basically gives you a context for the violence. And it was a collaborative project commissioned by METRAC, the Metropolitan Action Committee Against Violence Against Women and Children. And we did focus groups with Indigenous organizations here in the city who are listed at the end of the video. And most of the women who are in it are local activists. So we're just going to watch that before our elder arrives to properly open the session.
Thank Audrey for organizing it. And that's her production company. I'm Kim Stanton. I'm the legal director at LEAF, the Women's Legal Education and Action Fund. I did my doctoral dissertation in law on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission on Indian Residential Schools Legacy and the institutional design of public inquiries. So this panel, when Audrey and I were talking about it, is one that I'm very interested in because there's been such a vast amount of discussion lately about whether there should be a national inquiry on the missing and murdered women. And so we wanted to interrogate that question a little bit today. I also want to acknowledge that we're on the territory of several nations, including the Mississaugas of New Credit, the Haudenosaunee, the Wendat, others who make their home here. I'm sure I'm missing some. But with that, I think we'll get started, and then I'll introduce the panel afterwards.
I'm going to turn the light on.
Sure, yeah, thanks.
Good afternoon. My name is Laureen Blue Waters, and I'm going to do your opening for you today. I've been given tobacco, as is customary to do an opening. I'm going to pass around a bowl of sage here. We cannot sage in this, smudge in this building because of fire regulations. So I'm just going to pass this around, and if you want to take a piece of the sage and hold it with you, and that will be our smudge for today because we can't light it. So I'll just start at this end here, and you can just pass it around. If you don't want it, just pass it to the next person beside you. So I want to give thanks to the Mississaugas of the New Credit, the Huron-Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, on whose territory we are standing here today. Audrey had asked me if I would come and do the opening for this event, and of course this is an event that I hold very close to me. 1977, my grandmother was one of the murdered and missing women. And unlike some other people, though, we had closure. We found out who had murdered her, and that person was sentenced to a short term, nothing that we had thought that it would be, but we did have some type of a closure. And some of you out there may have relatives who have gone murdered and missing and do not have closure. So I ask that this sage today do its work as a medicine to help give you some of that healing that you'll need to carry on with your journey. And that those ancestors may help in some way to bring a closure to those women that are still missing out there. The murdered and missing women are our daughters, our sisters, our aunties, our mothers, our grandmothers. And you know, the things that have happened to them should never have happened. The Indigenous women are very strong women, and we find that for some reason they're the ones that are taken from us. Maybe it's because of their strength. But we that are left here have that strength as well. So my prayers will be today that you carry on with your strength, and that you carry on this challenge of seeking justice for those who have gone murdered and missing. But remember to do that in a kind and gentle way as well. You know, their lives were taken through violence, but that does not mean that we have to act in turn by violence. To be humble and to be calm and to be patient. Those are our teachings, and they're kind of hard teachings to follow because, you know, we become anxious, we become angry, and we want answers and we want them now. Unfortunately, we don't seem to get that. So I continue to pray for each and every one of you that answers will come to you and closures can come to you and that healing can take place and that we can put an end to this and have this senseless killing of all our murdered and missing Aboriginal women. And I pray that the police forces will you know, do the proper work that needs to be done in investigating every case. You know, for these women have value. They're not something that's thrown away. They're not something that should be just left and not looked into. You know, with resources and everything else, not to make excuse for the police, but their hands are sometimes full. But at the same time, we ask that those spirits come into their hearts so that they, in turn, too, know that it's something that they have to keep fighting for. It's something that they have to keep looking into. They have to use as many resources that they have to help solve these things so that not another one of our sisters or our aunties or our mothers or grandmothers go missing and are murdered. So today those ancestors come and they sit with us as when we call them, they do come. So I ask them to come and be with each and every one of us today and to help us hear the words that are going to be spoken today, because you know it's a very heartfelt topic that we're speaking of today. And a lot of people that are here and are outside and meetings that go on similar to this in different provinces, different cities, people have a hard time with it because it is something that's senseless. You know, it doesn't need to happen. So we pray that all those women out there will give teachings to their families and talk to their children and teach them the value of love and teach them that we are to be kind and gentle with each other. We're not to act out in violence and to take another person's life and to humiliate, to degrade, to bully, to shame. Those are not our ways, and those are ways that have been brought to us. And unfortunately, for some of us, we carry those ways, and those are not ours to carry. So my prayers are today that we do not carry those ways, that we put them back out there and don't take them with us on our journeys, so that we can be kind and loving and gentle to each other. We can follow in the ways that all our ancestors have lived, through nonviolence, building our communities with each other, picking each other up rather than tearing each other down, using good words to each other instead of being spiteful or being jealous, or instead of being resentful. You know, look at each other and see what it is that you can do to help that person rather than tear them down. Stop the lateral violence that exists in today's society. We're all part of that, and we have to do our parts. And if we do our parts as an individual, it spreads out into a community, and then to a city, and then to a province, and then to a nation. But if we don't start with ourselves, we can't move forward. And for all those that are suffering today from those effects from the murdered and missing women, I ask that you find a little bit of peace. I ask those ancestors to come and be with you, all those spirit helpers, so that they can help you listen to the words that are going to be said today, and that we can take them in a good way, and we can come together with one mind, and we can find solutions, we can find ideas that we can put out there to stop what's going on. So I ask this of our ancestors and the Creator, and I say thank you to each one of you for coming out here today, for taking your time to come here, to see what it is that you can learn, to see what it is that you can contribute, to use your words and find your words. So many of us don't have that ability to find our words. We sit back and we watch and we hear, but we can't find our words to speak what it is that we need to say. And when you do find those words, say them in a good way. Get your point across, but say it in a good way so that you're not hurting anyone, so that you're not offending anyone. Because ourselves, we don't like to be offended, we don't like to be hurt. So before we speak, think and say, how can I say what it is I need to say in a good way, and yet contribute so that we can stop this and we can build each other up. And so that's what I'd like to offer today to each and every one of you. I'd like to thank everyone for inviting me here to help do this opening for you, to start this event in a good way. And my thoughts and prayers will be with you as you sit here today and you listen, and also as you journey home to wherever you live, to whichever territory you come from, that you can be a strength in your community, so that you can bring this information to your communities and to your friends and to your families, and have them join in, and have them look for solutions and answers, and have them partake in events that will happen to bring awareness to this. Because it is something that needs to be kept in the forefront. It doesn't only affect Aboriginal people, it affects everyone. For every person who goes missing, that's a loss in our community. No matter where they're from, no matter which nation they're from, no matter which culture they have. They are a valuable part of our society, and we have to stand up and protect each member in our society, no matter where they are from. So thank you all for coming, and thank you for inviting me here today, and may we hear good and kind words, and may we hear information that we can build on and build us each up as an individual, and then as a community, and then as a nation. Hi, miigwech.
Thank you so much, Lori Waters. So just to start us off, I'm just going to introduce our panelists, and I think we'll have about 15 minutes per person, and then we'll have some time for discussion at the end. So we're going to begin with Audrey. Audrey Huntley is a documentary filmmaker, community researcher, and writer-producer of mixed European settler and Indigenous Anishinaabe ancestry. Audrey's co-founder of the coalition group No More Silence, which addresses the injustice and impunity surrounding the murders and disappearances of Indigenous women, girls, trans, and Two-Spirits. She has been doing community-based research in Indigenous communities in BC and Ontario since 1998. We discovered we actually overlapped in Vancouver for a while, so it's nice to be meeting up here. And as I mentioned, Audrey had the conception for the panel and put the panel together, and I'm very grateful for that. We have two other wonderful panels with us today. To my left is Naomi Sayers. She's an activist in Indigenous criminology and working towards graduating this April, and I understand you're off to law school, is that right?
Yes.
Uh-huh.
That's the
We'll talk. She's also the founder of the Southwestern Ontario Sex Workers and the creator of a blog that I've been reading of late called quaytoday.com. Her motto is, "Tell me I can't and I'll show you I can." So that's Naomi. And sitting next to Naomi is Christa Big Canoe. She's Anishinaabe Quay from the Otter Clan. She's a mother, wife, and lawyer, and aspires to increase access to justice for Aboriginal people. Christa is currently the Legal Advocacy Director at Aboriginal Legal Services Toronto, and we're very grateful to her for coming today because I think both her kids have been down with an ear infection, and also, I mean, both of them have a really strong interest in another panel that's happening at the same time, which I'm sure lots of people in the room do. So I'm not only grateful to all of you for coming, but also for our panelists to choose us instead of ditching us and going to the next room where they also are interested. But in all seriousness, I'm very grateful for us to have this conversation today. I think it's a conversation we really all need to be having, and so I'll turn it over to Audrey.
Thank you so much, Christa. Yeah, I feel a little awkward being on the panel since I organized the panel and sort of invited myself to speak on it. I'm only going to take up a little bit of your time.
I actually insisted that she be on the panel, so she's being far too modest, but...
Well, maybe I should mention why I'm even in the law union, because I'm a new member of the law union, and basically it's because I'm becoming a paralegal. So I'm 6 months through the program now, and I have spent quite a bit of time doing advocacy work as a community activist, and looking forward to having a career that hopefully will actually allow me to pay my rent, because documentary filmmaking hasn't really worked out so much. Yeah, so just briefly about the numbers. When I made this short video, it was a couple of years ago, and No More Silence was using the Native Women's Association of Canada numbers for a long time from the Sisters in Spirit project that you may have heard about. The funding was cut to that project in 2010 by the Harper government, who felt there was enough research had been done. And I think they had gathered 580 names, which was known to be incomplete at the time. No More Silence, the group that was mentioned, that Christa mentioned, has been active in Toronto for about almost 10 years. And our most recent and biggest project is creating a community-run database, a popular inquiry of sorts. We've actually been part of those calling for an inquiry for many years, but kind of stopped calling for it and got critical of it, and then we're a little bit surprised and overwhelmed by all the attention and all the calls. We're like, oh, where did all these people come from calling for an inquiry that we had supported along. Mostly we took our direction at No More Silence from the women who organized the Memorial March in Vancouver's downtown east side. When I first started doing this work, I was just coming back from Germany, where I went to school, and I ended up living in Vancouver, right close to Maine and Hastings. It was the late 90s when the Picton slaughter was basically happening, and women were going missing from the neighborhood. So I first got involved with this work in 1999. So the memorial marches have actually been happening in Vancouver for 23 years. And I think their list of names that they read out on February 14th is over 500 women now. Now those are not only Indigenous women, although a majority of those names probably are, just because of the makeup of the downtown east side population and the demographics. So that's, a long time that women have been doing this work and trying to raise awareness around it. I guess that's why we called ourselves No More Silence at the beginning, because back 10 years ago, it really was a matter of breaking the silence and raising awareness. And so we saw the ceremony that we do every February 14th really as a political act of public mourning, a mourning that should not be, restricted to our community and to, isolated instances of grief, but a mourning that really needs to be carried by the whole society. And I think by doing it publicly, we speak to the lack of that. And yeah, what I mentioned earlier, when I was at the CBC, I had an opportunity to do research, and I got to do a missing woman road trip where I interviewed over 45 family members of missing and murdered Indigenous women. And the patterns that I heard over and over again from people were really about that, not only the grief of the actual loss and the trauma and the horrific violence that usually occurs when an Indigenous woman is murdered. It usually happens in quite horrifically violent ways. But there's also the added layers of trauma that occur because of the lack of care, the overall societal indifference. So when I went out not knowing if anybody would even really want to talk to me, because actually having CBC as your name doesn't help you get interviews in the Native community. I mean, people have been burned by the media so many times. So I was very wary and unsure of whether anyone would even really want to speak to me. It was about sharing memories. We called it the Traces of Missing Women Project. And I didn't want to go chasing after people and actually seek them out. I didn't want to intrude on people's grief that way, but wanted them to know that there was this opportunity. So all I did was put up pink posters and had emails forwarded around introducing who I was and my background. And I ended up being absolutely overwhelmed by people wanting me to come by, so I did 17,000 kilometers basically no, it was 15,000 kilometers over a period of 7 weeks, zigzagging from Toronto to Thunder Bay across to Vancouver's downtown east side, which is, since I had moved from there to here, Picton had been arrested. And so there was a lot of people in that community that were very traumatized by, you know, just what was starting to come out at that time. And a lot of people who wanted to share. And then my journey took me up to northern BC, northern Alberta, back down through Regina, Saskatchewan, and back to here. But there wasn't a single community that wasn't affected. There wasn't any community that didn't have their stories of missing and murdered women. So when I ended up moving to Toronto, we saw the need to form this coalition. It's a coalition group of Indigenous women and allies. And we do the February 14th, but most recently we've started our own community-led database due to the vacuum that's been created by the cuts to Sisters in Spirit. And while we were doing this, we didn't know about Marianne Pierce, but a report came out in November of last year, which was her doctoral thesis. And this is a woman based in Ottawa who had been working, compiling data on missing and murdered women overall, not just Indigenous. So she's collected over 3,700 names of women murdered in Canada in the last 30 years. And she has 824 confirmed Indigenous women among those numbers. And she's also of Aboriginal ancestry and very interested in her work being used by the community. So that's been an amazing connection for us. We'll be meeting with her and other women from around the country for a second meeting in May. We'll be trying to bring all these numbers together. And we don't just want to document these deaths, but we want to actually create a public website where some of the information about these women's lives will be available as per the wishes of their family members to honor their lives that have been invisibilized too long. And we actually don't want to stop there. We actually want to, and as I've discovered doing this work, many family members are doing their own investigations because they don't feel that the police are helping them. So actually in the course of making Go Home Baby Girl, a documentary I made for the CBC, we solved the murder, a 13-year cold case. And I learned that it isn't actually so hard to solve these murders. If I could do it 13 years after a woman had passed. You know, coming from Toronto back to Vancouver, it shouldn't be so hard for the police to do that. And so No More Silence does primarily this educational awareness raising work, but also supports family members by holding our public gathering, but also when a death occurs and we're approached, then we'll try to provide some kind of advocacy, some way to help those families navigate the system. And that's why I'm really interested to hear from Christa today and from Naomi, who's going to be a lawyer soon, you know, what ways can these family members be better assisted, because the stories that we hear are quite awful. In Toronto, we had 3 violent deaths in 2013. Cheyenne Fox, Tara Gardner, and Bella Labucan McLean. And I know from Cheyenne Fox's family that they are very unhappy with the way the police approached that case. They concluded that it was a suicide within hours, although there wasn't a whole lot of evidence to indicate that. And their sole witness was a man who paid for Cheyenne's services, the last person to see her. She was thrown or fell from the 24th floor of a balcony. And her family is not happy with the outcome of that investigation. Her family also would like to know where their daughter died and hasn't been given that information from the police. So there's just like a lot of trauma in the aftermath as well. And that's why I'm, you know, looking forward. I'm happy that all of you as legal professionals have joined our panel today. And I think that's where I'm going to leave it and pass it on. Thanks for listening.
Over to you, Naomi.
Thank you. Okay, hi everybody. And one such system of domination includes colonialism. Further, Razik in her article highlights the problems with focusing on vulnerability of women instead of the systems of domination that increase this vulnerability. Mainstream white feminists often label Indigenous women as the most vulnerable as well. And their movements usually called for increased policing, yet at the same time, mainstream feminism often ignores how these efforts indirectly criminalize Indigenous women. In another article written by Cohn and Enlow, entitled In a Conversation with Cynthia Enlow, they highlight that feminists have taught us to be very, very careful before we adopt a response to grief, loss, and anger. That is a state response, especially a militarized state response. They also argue that we, women, should be on high alert. They, meaning the state, put it being gender issues or women's issues, back on the shelf just as soon as it no longer serves their longer range purpose. And this informs my critique in using a state response to missing and murdered Indigenous women issue, as the state will use this issue until it no longer serves their longer range in purposes. Wherein history has informed us that Indigenous peoples are not supposed to be here. The systems are designed to do exactly what they were meant to do, to get rid of the Indian problem. One issue with state responses is focusing on domestic violence, and that is done strictly in the home. One response to this was the various feminist responses to have pro-arrest policies of the 1980s. They have found that what occurred from those pro-arrest policies was that it increased women, and from my experiences, increased the criminalization of women, and from my experiences, it criminalizes Indigenous women. There are contradictions present in the reports that the government have done previously, and most recently, the one that was entitled Invisible Women, A Call to Action. It says that we are vulnerable yet still delinquent, that society needs to be protected from us, and that Indigenous women need to be protected from their own homes and communities, yet they're not offering protection for Indigenous women themselves. They say that perpetrators take advantage of this vulnerability, and the state take advantages of this vulnerability by not naming the issue, colonialism. And they also ignore the fact that the state is complicit in this violence. The report, Invisible Women, A Call to Action, is indicative of who gets to be heard and who is silenced. Just take a look at the witness list. It's not very long, and it only includes certain organizations. Also, this report only names residential schools, poverty, homelessness, racism, failure of services, jurisdictional barriers, but don't name the colonialism, which is everything that was listed is an effect of colonialism. They name a lack of continuous police presence as a challenge of protecting victims, yet sometimes Indigenous women face violence at the hands of police. Increased policing does not equal increased protection. The fact that the Indian Act was enacted before the Criminal Code of Canada is demonstrative of this pathway to criminalization of Indigenous peoples. For example, the definition of a gang in the Criminal Code is 3 or more people gathering to organize to commit crime. This definition was adopted by the Indian Act, where 3 or more Indians were not allowed to gather. And especially for Indigenous sex workers, their criminalization is heightened, and the history of these laws show us that they originated in the Indian Act. One of the recommendations was to collect ethnicity variables. This was in the report. For violence against Aboriginal women, police already do collect ethnicity variables, and it's only when they're criminalized. They also make another recommendation to protect against violence and prostitution, when Chief Justice already said in her decision in the Bedford versus Canada decision released in December 2013 that it was the prohibitions imposed that made dangerous conditions for prostitution, and that increased the risks rather than the safety of working in the trade. The report that Peter MacKay threw on the ground in the House of Commons just outlined all the accomplishments, for lack of a better word, by the Conservative government, including the Truth in Sentencing Act, the Safe Streets Act, the Offender Accountability, just to name a few. This outlines a contradiction with how the government treats Indigenous issues and the safety of Indigenous people, including Indigenous women, that they need increased policing powers to create mandatory sentencing and to limit granting credit for time served, all which increases criminalization and prison population. The prison is the new residential school. We need to take into consideration how justice looks and feels to various communities. Justice for one community may not be the same for another. Just like calling for an inquiry where we remain divided, one community may want one, another community may not want one. We need to look at how the government, conservative or not, has treated previous reports and inquiries. Yes, the Missing Women Inquiry was conducted to address the missing and murdered women in Vancouver's downtown east side, but it told us it was the lack of response from police. The Invisible Women Report also stated the same thing. The inquiry may take too long from beginning to end. It may not be satisfactory to some, and they will still demand justice. They will still be left feeling empty. To outline how the inquiry works, this is part of the blog that I've written, and the source was from the Native Women Association of Canada website. They're one of the organizations who are calling for an inquiry, aggressively calling for an inquiry. So specifically, the National Inquiry is set up formally and its jurisdiction is established by legislation. Its set duration established in terms of reference. This means that the inquiry can be short, medium, or long. The inquiry can be headed by one or more commissioners with legal and supporting staff. It is often open to public, including document, process, hearings, and final reports. And the final reports may be posted on the internet, kind of like the 150-plus page Wally Opal report. Some organizations like to say that the inquiry's relationship to the government is independent, but this is contradictory in itself because it is established by the government, because it really isn't independent. The cost can be high for all the same lame reasons that we need an inquiry in the first place. The structure is dependent on the terms of reference, the process is dependent on the term of reference, and the activities include generally intended to advise or investigate and may call subject matter expert witnesses, etc. This is where only certain voices and bodies matter to the inquiry. Just think who is going to be called to be a witness and who isn't. What differential power relations are at play here? Where will the hearings be held? How will the witnesses be able to get there? And as for the big kicker for future actions, these are at the discretion of the governments that establish the inquiry, which won't be done by Harper, I will tell you that much. And that includes if the government who established the inquiry remains in power after the inquiry is over. Additionally, participation is only granted by commissioner at hearings, and maybe, just maybe, written submissions may be accepted, probably in English, which is ultimately views Indigenous languages as inferior, you know, the usual. And don't forget, all of this is non-binding. Translation, the government can do what it has done before in other inquiries, ignore it. But what does justice look like? A lot of people support restorative justice responses, but we also need to take a look into the issues with restorative justice. A response to the inadequacy to the restorative justice is transformative justice approaches. Andrea Smith on her blog writes, the transformative justice model builds on restorative justice. To hold that our goal is not to restore a community to a state that was structured by oppression, but to create and transform communities so that they are less oppressive. In addition, whereas restorative justice models generally operate through the state, through sentence diversion programs, transformative justice models operate outside the legal system altogether, which advocate, as Smith highlights, for community-based responses. Relying on police presence or policing initiatives may have the opposite response, like the criminalizations of victims themselves, like especially in relation to the domestic violence cases as I referenced earlier. One suggestion listed by Smith in her list of transformative justice strategies is to create a neighborhood check-in program as opposed to a neighborhood watch program. This shows that everyone is connected in the community and builds positive relationships as opposed to the neighborhood watch approach, which assumes everyone who don't know or who looks suspicious is an offender. History tells us that the state's goal is to get rid of the Indian problem, and this is in full effect today with the epidemic of missing and murdered Indigenous women. We need to support community-based responses, and we need to return to the community to solutions. Thank you.
Once she gets through law school. Gichi Chimon, Anin Winabujo, Christa Gichi Chimon, Nadishnakaz, Nagig Dodam, Wasi Egamak Donjaba, Nodenkwa Nishnabekwe, Ogimekwe, Ganund Majig, Gakina, Gui, Wabama, Debwiwin. Miigwech, Nosamisik, Shosamisik, Elder Bluewater, Mississauga is the new credit, Haudenosaunee, Wendat, Algonquin, ASCII, the Law Union of Ontario. Thank you. My name's Christa Big Canoe. As my introduction from Kim was, I'm of the Otter clan. I come from Georgina Island First Nation, which is just a little north of here. It's literally on Lake Simcoe. It's 45 minutes if there's no traffic. The traditional way we named that place was Wasi Egamak, place of shining waters. Of course, Lake Simcoe is named after someone in government, and and Georgina Island is the Anglified version of our name. It was given once it was set as a reserve land, one of these impositions of the Indian Act.
I forgot to mention we're in Victoria College, so.
Yeah. So I want to start with a brief story, just a brief story. I'm hoping it's going to come back around for you. I want to tell you about one of my clients, who, by the way, told me I could talk about this without obviously getting into too many details, but because she's a prime example of this story that's worth telling. And the way she comes to our office is through criminal injuries compensation, because she's been seriously harmed and violated in a very, very intimate and bad way. And when she comes into her office, she is full of strength and energy, like you've seen no person. To see this young woman, you would never guess. Her life story has been filled with, sexual abuse as a child, a lot of alcoholism within the family and circle. She gains some independence, breaks out on her own, and has high prospects of doing really well. Graduates high school, comes to a big city with a promising career, and falls into a relationship with a non-Aboriginal man who introduces her to drugs of choice she's never tried in her life. And the story is so familiar, isn't it? It's so familiar for so many of us within Aboriginal communities, because what we thought was this person breaking out of sort of some systemic issues, a community that lacked a number of things like regular clean drinking water, access to education, was exposed to a number of lateral violence issues within the community, and yet someone who sort of exemplifies breaking free from some of those typical things comes back full circle into this situation. And this young, strong woman, because she is a young, strong woman, and she still is promising and continued to be promising throughout all of, and I hate the word victimization, but that's the way the legislation, when we're talking about criminal injuries compensation, deals with her as a victim of crime. I prefer to think of her as a survivor, because in her relationship, she's turned out and starts doing in-house or sort of call-in prostitution. She's put into a situation over the course of a couple of years where her addictions increase, she has more and more exposure to the sex trade, and it comes to a very violent peak. And despite that very violent peak, when she reaches out, each and every time she reaches out to the police, or her neighbors reach out for her because she's afraid to call the police, her interactions with the police exemplify the ignorance that many police services have towards both sex workers and Aboriginal women. In one of her first interactions, they tell her she's a whore, so why should she be surprised? In a second interaction, they talk to her about returning to her home community or reserve. She doesn't like it in the big city. That's two examples. In another instance, they will not charge the individual because she chooses to be there, is their belief. So finally, when he does break her hand, break a rib, and her face, they finally decide to lay charges. What happens? She's afraid to testify against him. But she cooperates, she gives the video statement. The matter, he pleads out. So, you know, what happens? He gets like the 90 days or whatever it was and a probation. And of course, you know, this is where I always have a problem as a lawyer, right? This is where I have a problem because I'm always arguing against criminalization and incarceration on one hand, and on the other hand, I'm trying to protect survivors' rights. So, you know, as the story goes, where she's left, and by the way, he continues to bother her. He follows her through social media, causes threats, all sorts of stuff. So again, the police get involved because they're a very public record. And so when she goes to testify against him this time, she's just continuously attacked by his defense counsel, which, you know, most good defense counsels would probably try to do to impeach her credibility. So, you know, she's on the stand talking about how she, yes, has prostituted herself, but why does that make her less credible? Of course, you know, again, he gets a fairly minor sentence, but finally she puts herself in a safe space where he can't reach her. The only recourse she has left to seek any level of compensation for loss of time at work, all of her injuries, is the criminal injuries compensation. And, you know, thank goodness for that, but it has a maximum of $25,000 for pain and suffering. And we'll have to go before board, and she's going to have to disclose, and there's a provision within even that act that's going to ask, you know, did you contribute to your own injury? And I'm obviously, you know, in a place where I'll make arguments that she didn't, given the domestic violence situation, but that's always a possibility that an adjudicator will look at her choices to continue doing drugs and alcoholism or sex, which of course I would argue it wasn't unlawful in house calls in terms of the criminal code even prior to Bedford, but that, and even, you know, as far as it goes, where's this individual, this really strong woman now? She's actually back in school, she's doing well, she's been free of addictions for 2.5 years. And you know what, when she talks to me, what she says is she's afraid she's gonna end up down this road again if she's not really careful. What can I, you know, the legal advocacy director at Aboriginal Legal Service, do to help her ensure she doesn't continue to have bad relations with police, with hospitals? And you know what? I sit there sometimes and I shake my head. I really don't know. What is the perfect answer? You know, she's on a good path now, so you encourage that in terms of like her trajectory of success and her strength, and you focus on that. But when you look at her, whenever she does have police interactions, because she's on their radar, despite, you know, being clean for 2 years, or despite, you know, living a good life or living in a good way, you know, if she gets stopped or she's with somebody, they know her. So what do I say to her? Well, you know, there's a police complaints process. Well, anybody who does police complaints might know that it's not a very satisfactory outcome very often. What other options are there? It's really sad because here's this young woman who wants more answers, and I often feel like I can't give them to her. I really can't. You know, she wants to know about other women from her community that have experienced this type of violence, and she comes from a community where there are currently 2 missing women. And so, you know, and I can say that without like giving any details away, because the sad reality is in Canada we have so many communities where there's 2 or more women missing, right? And so it leaves me kind of in this predicament of, you know, always searching for solutions or answers, and often within the Canadian law context coming up short. And so I don't think I have to focus a lot of time on it, because we've already heard a lot about the connection between colonialism and the violence that missing and murdered Indigenous women have been experiencing in this country. You know, we've heard about the Indian Act. Anyone who's heard me speak before knows I am not a huge fan of the Indian Act. So I won't rant about the Indian Act today. But, you know, where are we? Where are we? We're in a space and time, and as you heard Naomi speaking particularly about the last report that comes out of Parliament, we're in a place and time where we have a government that refuses refuses to respect or even consider pluralism. And what do I mean by pluralism? I'm talking about like the legal pluralism that exists. True pluralism, one that respects and understands Indigenous law has a place in this country. One that respects and understands that, as you know, we saw in the video at the beginning, and I think it was Christa Williams, the one part that always, every time I see that video, it kind of jumps out at me when Christa Williams, who is the ED at the Aboriginal Youth Sexual Health Network, I think I got that right.
Native Youth Sexual Health
Thank you.
Network, she's their community outreach.
Right, so every time I see Christa say that one point, we don't need saving. We are in the best position to understand. And then you see all this community activism where, you know, as Audrey was telling you, it was a group of, you know, Indigenous people that started pushing for the call for inquiry. And you see the community come together, and then it's only like often in the 11th hour, and again, as Naomi touched on, when it seems to serve a cause for a platform, that we get up like a whole host of support, and then it fades away again, right? And it always surprises me how so many Canadians can be like, we know this many women are murdered and missing, and we don't care enough when the government, and I'm not saying this room, I mean, I think this room's exempt. I know I'm singing to the choir. But, you know, by and large, most Canadians are like, well, what are they still complaining about? You know, so the government looked at it, and they've decided that, you know, it's more important that we give you these 15 recommendations. 15 recommendations, by the way, that are very, like, rarely informed by Indigenous view. And this goes back to this concept of pluralism. How do we marry or acknowledge pluralism, okay? And there's something that Professor Tracy Lindbergh, and that's what I was actually trying to look up earlier when you saw me, I wasn't ignoring Naomi's thing, I was trying to look up something Professor Lindbergh just had posted recently, and she was talking about this concept. Pluralism goes deeper than common law, civil law, Indigenous law. It actually has to recognize Indigenous law in and of itself has pluralism, right? And so if you think, and you know, this is what Tracy says, if you think it's about who represents an authentic Indigenous voice, or about the Indigenous team versus another in protecting our rights, you've bought into the colonial belief and dream of what Indigenous people see. So when I hear Christa saying we don't need saving, and at the same time we're asking our allies for support, it seems contradictory, but it's really about understanding more systems working together at once than not. So although I agree mostly with Naomi, I'd say that, you know, we can't just let the government off the hook on these issues. There has to be a level of accountability. Maybe we don't want it in a forum where they have whole jurisdiction, but what does a forum that recognizes pluralism and Indigenous partners towards are advocating for, I think, is like to give true meaning. And of course, you know, the questions come up and the hairs get split around, well, who's gonna pay for it and where does the funding come from? And you know, I always come back to the point, like, how many more women have to die or go missing before, like, what is the value or money? You know, what's the cost savings benefit to doing something with meaning? And you know, recently we had one of the conservative ministers say, well, we know what the problem is. And I was like, please tell me, I've been like trying to search for it for 35 years. What is the problem? And we don't know what the problem is. And yeah, we are studied to death as a group. We gotta stop focusing on an inquiry just being a process of study with only experts. Recognize experts who can lay out what the issues are. We have been studied to death. Let's start looking at an inquiry process that may actually bring into place experts who can talk about community or even expert means and manners to actually resolve some of the issues that the women are experiencing. If we know what the problem is, then we should know what the solution is. So I know I was very furious the day that piece came out. I was like, we know what the problem is. Real easy for a man who hasn't, you know, got relatives missing to say, but and it's hard because we get frustrated, I think. You know, I'm a Canadian lawyer. I practice Canadian law. And like, I really love to believe deep down, and I, you know, for years I said, maybe it's just I'm being naive, but I still believe, or I wouldn't still be doing it, I think, that we have an opportunity here to make some change, even if it's incremental in various forums and in different ways. And then we have bad days where we get back, you know, a OPRIT report that says, oh yeah, there's no wrongdoing. Or an SIU report that says, no, there's no wrongdoing. Sorry, you know, her face was broken in 3 places by a police officer, but he was just acting, you know, in a manner of, use of force that was allowable because she was resisting. And you get these things, and you have your down days, and then you have your highs. And so where I find myself often now, and it feels like you're talking in circles or walking in circles, but then you do have successes. And then you do find advocates and allies that help promote what you're doing. So what should be acknowledged, you know, when we're talking, if we're talking about meaningful pluralism, law and politics that are gonna actually accept that there's Indigenous ways or the good way to do things, or even if we have to marry them to find resolve, we should be acknowledging, one, that there's different Indigenous groups, so there's plurality even amongst the Indigenous groups that are at the table. We should be including some of the traditional beliefs and values. And I'm gonna use two examples. They're not universal to all nations, so it contradicts what I just said. But for instance, Grandmother Moon, or the Seven Grandfather Teachings, as sort of places to start. Because although they may seem like wishy-washy, so for example, if you walk into ALST, there's a little bulletin board that has the Seven Grandfather Teachings, and if you just see the words up there, you think, well, isn't that quaint? You know, truth and honesty and humility and love, and you're thinking, well, that's kind of nice. But if you actually understand Ganok Nagawin, the legal, Indigenous legal principles behind what each of those things mean, they're not that different than a codified type of law. I would put out to you just an analogy, because they actually set out a way that we are supposed to be and act towards each other as human beings, which is no different than any other type of law and order, quite frankly. In fact, there's a little more strength in it. So if we can find a way to do that, and we look at what real activism is, community activism, where there's real community voice, I think we have a difference. So, you know, if I was pushing this whole group and trying to get you all in, you know, as allies, I'd be saying that activism looks more like, how do we, instead of calling for, you know, a federal inquest, how do we make the decision makers understand that it requires more than just one jurisdiction to be part of any resolve? Because so long as it's always under the federal jurisdiction or led by federal jurisdiction, it's the same as what, you know, Indians within the Indian Acts face. It's outside of our own, it's outside of our own control. It's something that's determined for us, defined for us, named for us, and the end result often is in our best interests. And I would put to this group that that's no different than the false assumptions on which, you know, Canada itself was founded in law, that, you know, when you hear Christa Williams and other women in that video say, we don't need saving, that's what got us here in the first place. What we need is allying and partnering. People who truly understand the issues, or are willing to listen to the issues and carry those issues to others. I think, how much time do I have?
Well, you know, up to, say, 4 more minutes.
Oh, okay, up to 4 more minutes. Love that. That's great, because I want to also touch on a couple other things. Audrey mentioned that last year there were 3 deaths of Aboriginal women here in Toronto. 2 of them were off of high-rises. Again, I have the family's permission, and we actually do media releases and stuff, so it's known that Aboriginal Legal Services represents the Bella's family. And so, you know, one of the points I want to touch on is, you know, where do we go from here when you are dealing with, for instance, police processes or what have you? That's an ongoing investigation. It happened in July of last year. Most of the time, our office spends time writing letters or contacting people trying to instigate an investigation, trying to get the police services to care and listen. You know, the prior year we lost a community member who we couldn't get them to declare him as missing. He just had head surgery, and like he had head surgery and was very vulnerable because of the head surgery, and we couldn't get the police to deem him missing. We just couldn't. We tried everything. Through the family, through advocacy, we tried to explain, you know, this individual, he's missing. And so they finally deemed him missing about 2 weeks after he was missing, and about 2 weeks after that, they found his body. Had the family been able to, because the family went to where he was last seen and known and put up posters, and no one even paid attention. And they always feel like if we had just had that, you know, that the police supporting us saying that this is indeed a missing person, as opposed to some very Aboriginal looking man who was kind of spooky looking because his head at the time was half shaved, and the other half was long hair. So, you know, usually what we spend our time doing is trying to get the police to raise an investigation. In Bella's case, the investigation's ongoing, but it's very difficult if you find yourself in this, you know, sort of legal quandary. It's very difficult to try to allege any breach of duty of care or against the police if the investigation hasn't closed. Why? Because you can't get your hands on stuff from the coroner's office till the investigation closes. You don't get the report from the police till the investigation closes. So how do you actually attack potential breach of duty of care? You're left in a conundrum, right? So the other thing is you actually want the investigation, right? If you really care about your client's family, you want the investigation to be fulsome. You want the police to take the time to thoroughly do their job so that, in hopes that the family can find answers. So you also don't want to interfere with that. But then you're left in this space and time where from July of last year till now, you don't have a solid answer. You can't actually understand what diligence or due diligence has been done or hasn't been done by the police. You don't want to tromp on the investigation. And so it remains questions for the family. And how do you talk to those clients? You know, how do you explain to them, well, you know, what I usually do is I fight for the police to get involved. Now they're involved. What can I do now? And so you're left in this space and time again where for the families you feel helpless. And then you start looking to what are civil resolves and should I be referring you out to someone who can maybe go after somebody else? And so, you know, you're left in this place where, you know, Bella, if none of you are familiar with her, but I'm sure some of you have heard of her in the paper, was a beautiful young woman, had graduated Humbert Sign, again, bright prospects in future. And one evening, as she's attending a party, the next morning her body's found. And the police can't even find which floor she fell from, and they're going door to door knocking. And then they later discover it's on the 31st floor, and nobody noticed her gone. All the people in the apartment don't notice her gone, and that's, you know, problematic. Because immediately the place that police often want to go is, well, obviously this was suicide. So, but there's been, you know, there's no mental health issues in the family. There never has been with her. So, you know, you're left with, and currently, like literally, I've been advised that they still haven't determined whether it was homicide, accident, or suicide. And that's July. So, the community, like when you wonder why Aboriginal community feels left out or shut out of any of these processes, this is why, because there's no answers to these things, but we keep seeing. And anyone who has a sister, a friend, a mother, a daughter who's Indigenous, we worry in a completely different way than even women worry generally, I think, about the safety of our loved ones. And so there's legitimacy in that. And just, you know, to wrap up, do I have 1 minute left?
1 minute.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Sorry, it'll just take me a second. I'm going to read you a poem. Not knowing from where it comes. In a good way, finding words to say. Loss of our sisters, daughters, and mothers at the hands of our two-legged brothers. Avoiding the anger, avoiding the danger. Not knowing from where it comes. Tears run dry, fears stay high. Not knowing from where it comes. Videos, stereotypes, all the hype. I'm not your bitch squaw. To name, reclaim, blame, or to bring fame, not knowing where it comes. Take me home, not the place, nor the space, but the spot missing in my heart. I'm tired of the shame and still remain, not knowing from where it comes. Lead me home, take me please, to help me and others find a good way.
So we have about a little over 15 minutes for discussion. And I'll just ask when you're asking questions to be respectful of everyone else and just take a little bit of time with your question so that other people have the opportunity to speak as well. So does anybody want to begin? And maybe while you're thinking of your questions, I can just sort of talk a little bit about the inquiry piece, because we had the Missing Women Inquiry in Vancouver, which was a train wreck from start to finish, and the work that I've done on inquiries really points to two things about how inquiries, one is the leadership that's appointed in the first place, and then the second one is the process that's used, the way the commission is actually designed and how it runs its process. And those two things will absolutely determine how it's going to go. And so the Missing Women Inquiry was doomed from the start with the appointment of Wally Opal, who was just the wrong person to appoint to that inquiry on so many levels. I mean, not the least of which was he was Solicitor General when the charges, the additional charges against Robert Picton were dropped, right? So he had a conflict of interest. It was, he shouldn't legally have been appointed to that commission. So there are structural things that can be done to have inquiries that actually run in a good way and that can accomplish things, but you have to ask yourself from the start, if you were to set up a commission of inquiry, what would you want it to achieve? If everything was done well, if you had the right people appointed, if you had the right process, if you had really good terms of reference, if you had the budget to do it all, what would you actually want to achieve with that? And so I think that that kind of question helps determine whether an inquiry is a good idea at all, because it helps you sort of think through what would the institutional design need to be for it to be a helpful thing. And my concern is that in Canada, we have the structural violence of colonialism, and that I'm pretty sure isn't the problem that the guy identified when you were but until non-Indigenous Canadians come to terms with that context, it will be pretty hard to have an inquiry that would achieve all of the things that we want to achieve. So my question, working at a national women's organization, is how do we then proceed in a way that is helpful? Sort of everybody gets on the bandwagon of calling for a national inquiry because you want to do something, you feel like you want to do something, but you don't know what that something is other than what your Canadian lawyer brain tells you, which is, well, what we do when we have a deep societal problem is we have a public inquiry. So that's the context that we're working in, and so I think the most useful thing for people like me to do is to stop speaking and listen to women who do have ideas about what's the way forward. So I hope that gives somebody some time to think about what they might like to ask or discuss. Thank you. Go ahead.
Hi. My question is primarily for Christa Big Canoe, because it was your comment about the tension between over-incarceration, and I want a little bit to think about it. I'm wondering whether you agree or disagree with something I think I've observed in criminal practice, is that we don't really have a good social mechanism for the idea of closure in our society, and that can play into the hands of a law and order agenda that actually gives rise to over-incarceration. So that's something that I struggle with just generally in criminal defense practice, but because the questions of closure and of over-incarceration are so particularly alive in the area of First Nations issues, I wonder if you can just comment on that idea and tell me if you think you see any solutions to how we could address those issues differently.
Well, being that I'm Aboriginal legal, I think one of the things I've learned the most in the 3 years I've been there, but also just in life, is we have to start recognizing things just aren't mutually exclusive. That you can absolutely be a victim and be, do criminal acts at the same time. And so, looking back at the concept of colonialism, and anyone who knows me also knows that I don't say we're in post-colonial time. I acknowledge that we're still experiencing colonialism. So looking, in the lens, a Canadian legal lens, in hopes to fix something that the law itself doesn't necessarily always recognize very well, that a person can be a victim as well as someone who's committing the criminal acts without looking at the restorative justice lens the same way. And so one thing I've learned at Aboriginal Legal is, how do you translate that? And we see it well play out well in places like Gladue courts in Toronto, right? But other jurisdictions don't have the advantage of those courts, even in Ontario.
Even the ones that say they have them have no idea what they're for or how they work.
Exactly. And even, arguably, even here, there's still room yet, because, the process is reliant on a Crown approving something for diversion. It's still treated as diversion. It's still treated sort of through the mechanism of the criminal justice system, right? So I think, we're seeing progress in therapeutic courts and in places like Gladue courts. We're seeing that progress where there's a recognition that you can have one and the other together, which results. And so, when you're actually applying, for instance, Gladue to an Aboriginal person, and you apply the principles, you can see that there's an opportunity for restorative, but the whole system doesn't embrace restorative justice mechanisms or Indigenous laws in a way that actually would give meaning to creating safer communities who have gone through, arguably are post-traumatic stress. Like even communities where there wasn't, all the people didn't attend residential school, even communities where there isn't rampant violence the same way. There's almost virtually untouched in this country, a reserve or Aboriginal community that isn't post-traumatized simply on the basis of the colonial experience. And so, there is no easy answer again. What you do is you keep pushing the limit. But for example, why is that such a bad idea even outside of Gladue?
It's not, and I worry that it's precisely because there's no principled distinction between restorative justice for First Nation communities and recognizing that that's a progressive idea generally, but that we have a law and order agenda that would make that very unpopular, that it makes it difficult for the idea of the Gladue court to get the traction that it should.
Yeah.
Because it's quite rightly recognized that I think that's the best slippery slope. I'd love to slide down that slope, but judges and crowns and the people who hold power don't want to come with us. And so it makes it hard even for First Nations people to access those services, because that's what would logically follow.
No, it's true. And I don't know if I can actually answer the second part of the question you gave me, because I don't think I envision closure the same way that mainstream does. And I may be a Canadian lawyer, but I've never been able to get my head around it, because at the end of an inquest, when we've gotten really good recommendations or something, I still turn to the mom and dad who have lost their loved one. And we may have fought a good battle and got some wins, but at the end of the day, I think the First Nation concept, at least in Anishinaabe, and that's all I can really speak to, the Anishinaabe concept of closure is just not the same thing, because I don't think we actually, at least from my perspective and my teaching in my community, I don't think we look at stuff as closing. Things are always sort of evolving, growing, and changing into things, and there is no such thing as closure. And I think as long as we're hoping to hang our hats on something like specific closure, or the way it's sort of envisioned in mainstream law or victimization, we'll never actually achieve the results that Indigenous people are hoping for.
I think mainstream law perpetuates this simplistic idea of closure to prop up a law and order agenda.
Absolutely, I agree.
I saw another question over here. Someone right here. Thank you. Go ahead.
Hi. My name is Chloe Kelly, and I'm just visiting here from Vancouver. And I am a frontline worker in the downtown east side. I worked for many years with women working the streets at night, and was in a violent incident and was moved to, so I work now with mostly men. And I'm part of the Memorial March Committee, and I'm part of a Coalition for Safety of Women in the Downtown East Side, and also working with community members. Since the death of Ashley Machisnik, who was also fell out of a window, it was called a suicide in the Downtown East Side, and when that happened, there was a lot of us, we did a ceremony for her, and then the community just marched to the police station and drummed and sang on the steps of the police station for 5 hours, demanding that the police do proper investigation this time. And that's how we dealt with that situation. And since then, they do try to Well, they do talk to us when something happens, and they do try to pay a little more attention to the community when they're investigating deaths of Aboriginal women. So I can say that that's, you know, one way of getting their ear is just to get out drums and just occupy something. You know, just stop them. We also, when it was time for the public inquiry to take place, and our groups were excluded from the inquiry process, we talked a lot about how to best deal with that situation, and we decided that we would, we talked about having an inquiry of the inquiry, like a community inquiry of the inquiry as it was going on. And we didn't really have enough people to do it. But what we envisioned was getting legal students together and making sure that every day of the inquiry that we had someone there reporting what happened, what evidence was disclosed, and releasing it to the community. And in the end, we weren't able to achieve that. But what we did was every week of the inquiry, we blocked the traffic in the very center of Vancouver, right outside of where the public inquiry was taking place. We stopped the traffic, and we had a circle with elders and the drummers. And we sang so that the family members inside could hear us. And they told us that it was a great comfort to them. And then some of us would be inside listening. And out of that, I have to say that even though the inquiry was a sham, there was a lot of really valuable information that came out of it in testimony. It was covered up. And the recommendations that came out of it were, a lot of them, even though Wally Opal was at the head of it, there were some strong recommendations that were useful. The trouble is that there was, the follow-up is the problem. And this is why if there was a national inquiry, I support a national inquiry, because in the hopes that we would be able to carry that through with the United Nations coming to do their...
On women.
Yeah.
And I mean, well, several hundreds and hundreds of recommendations that could have been implemented and haven't been. And you're right, it's that piece.
That's the part of it. That's the really important part of it. With all the energy and all the funding and attention goes into the inquiry, and the appointment of the champion, the community should have a really strong say in who is that champion and who's accountable for seeing that those recommendations are followed, because in the end it's the action that matters.
There's something interesting right now going on in Ontario. It's a review though, it wasn't an inquest or it wasn't a commission, it was Justice Jacobucci doing a review on juries. And the thing that's interesting that's happening right now is the implementation committee. So his first recommendation was that my recommendations get implemented, and it's done by a committee. And so they struck up a committee. And so I think the committees, I could stand to be correct, but I believe the committee's 11. So there's 5 government appointees and 5, so there's co-chairs. One's well-respected Grand Chief, and then, so he has 5 appointees. And then there's like a ministry person who has 4 appointees. So the implementation committee is sort of this joint effort at implementing the recommendations. You know, we could argue, we could sit here and argue about how great are the recommendations or what have you, but I think at least strategically and potentially not just optically, but if the implementation committee is given actual teeth to implement the report, then you're at least looking at sort of a more balanced, I'm not saying it's perfect, I'm not saying it's ideal, but a more balanced approach at involving and including, you know, Aboriginal community with the sort of government that's accountable for the need of change. So, and it's one of those things, I think, you know, I think we look at something like Ipperwash and see, you know, the commissioner there and all the work they did, but we look at something like the missing woman and we see, you know, the exclusion of the people who it was most important were there. And so,
it's interesting, if you look at the Aboriginal Justice Inquiry in Manitoba, the men who were involved in the death of Helen Betty Osborne were not given standing. the families and the communities were given standing. And then there was an Aboriginal Justice Inquiry Implementation Commission that was set up. And so there's models for this to work, but I mean, you have to take in hand all of the criticisms as well that surround it. And so, but we don't have to reinvent the wheel. There really are ways to do this that I'm sure, you know, are being adopted. Did we want to, I know we've got a couple of minutes left, and I just wondered if the panelists want to just say any closing comments before we finish. Did you want to?
I forgot to mention that No More Silence has released a statement together with Families of Sisters in Spirit and the Native Youth Sexual Health Network, who saw Christa Williams in the video. And you can find that. It goes into a bit more detail about all the work that we are actually doing now to solve the problem, which we think is a really long-term path, basically towards decolonization. But you can find it. There was a series called It Ends Here. That was on the Indigenous Nationhood Movement's blog. So if you Google It Ends Here, and the title of our piece is It Starts With Us. It starts with us. And you have some concrete idea of all the work that we're doing.
Thanks.
Yeah, so like when I critique the inquiry, it's not like I'm saying no, we shouldn't have one. But if we are going to have one, like we should be strategic about it. Like the 2015 election election's going to happen. So we know that probably political parties are going to, except for conservatives, they will have it on their platform. And like we should hold those parties accountable to their promises to support Indigenous women and the violence that they experience. So it's like, yeah, maybe raising awareness right now in the need to call for one or the need to have a better inquiry response would happen now up until the election, and then whoever gets the election then be strategic.
I would just add to both what Audrey and Naomi are saying is really to engage. It's great to have allies calling and demanding accountability from governments, but I think part of it is having that conversation, that really important conversation about what are the real issues and what is it, because I think it's really easy to get caught up in the hype or sort of like the bandwagon approach that, hey, everybody's doing this and I'm a thoughtful Canadian that wants to support this and make sure that Indigenous women have, all the benefit of this stuff. But I think we need to start recognizing, again, out of that whole group of different Indigenous voices, what are the big issues? Is it really about being studied more to understand why we're experiencing so much more violence? Or is it really about finding better solutions moving forward and ways for communities to heal? And does that sometimes mean we have to ask the questions that make us uncomfortable when we're talking about things like racism or colonialism? Then yeah, we do. So, I think part of that is like keeping your ear open to the different things. The site, It Ends Here and It Starts With Us, great, read the information on that, because I think it does actually give a really good perspective. And, I think more and more what we're starting to do is find alternatives. In an inquest out in Winnipeg, we're doing the same thing right now. Basically all the issues that were of importance to us were thrown off the table, so now we're finding alternative methods to talk about it, because when you engage students, when you engage public, when you engage people, it increases. I think about my children and how much more they know than I knew about life in general, but then about actual social issues, and it astounds me. Like, we're creating little people that are going to move forward with good social justice agendas. So, it sounds very simplistic, but, move the message forward, learn, listen, share. Because it's that real grassroots that actually evolves into a bigger movement.
Thanks so much, and I just wanted to thank the Law Union and also Audrey for instigating the panel, but also a big thank you to our panelists. And I know there's people who want further discussion, but we're just going to wrap it here, and then you can have sort of more informal discussion after this. So thank you so much.